Hello and welcome to our beginner's guide to COP26. So what is COP26? Well, it's the United Nations climate change talks. It's known as the Conference of Parties, the parties being the signatories to the agreement. And they happen every year, and this year is the 26th round of those talks. And previous talks have been quite important and set international targets, such as COP21, which was in Paris in 2015. But many experts believe that COP26 this year has a very unique urgency about it. And to understand why, we have to go back a little bit to what was agreed in Paris during COP21. For the first time ever in Paris, something momentous happened, and all the countries present agreed to work together to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees. In fact, they aimed for a 1.5 degree rise maximum. They also agreed to adapt to the impacts of a changing climate rather than to pretend it doesn't happen, and to make money available to deliver on these aims. And this was known as the Paris Agreement. The commitment to aim for 1.5 degrees was really important because the more the climate warms, the more damage and the more lives and livelihoods are lost. Under the Paris Agreement, countries bring forward new plans every 5 years, known as nationally determined contributions, and 5 years is up this year at COP26. That's why it's really important. The other reason it's really important is because we didn't do very well globally at limiting our temperature rises to 1.5 degrees, as we agreed in Paris at COP21. The clock is ticking. This is urgent. The other reason COPs are really important is because it allows countries in the global south, those poorer nations, to come alongside and interact on an equal footing with the more industrialised countries, such as ourselves and the United States. We need to pray that new targets are met during COP26. So why do we need this urgent action on climate change? Why is COP26 so important? Well, you can see from these images here, which look at historical records from 1880 and then project through into the future till 2100, that the globe is generally on a warming trend, global warming. We call it climate change now because warming is not the only consequence. It will lead to unequal consequences. You can see how unequal the temperature variation is on these images. Changing weather patterns will lead to things such as crop failures, to drought, to changes in seasonality, and unpredictable and extreme weather events. It'll lead to rising sea levels, and in places, entire nations will lose their homes. So what are the key conversations going to be at COP26? Well, first is to look at ways of adapting climate change that protect the communities, the food supplies and the natural habitats. Don't forget the natural world is also important. It supports us as human beings. How to look at climate finance. So how do you finance solutions to this crisis? How do you help the poorer countries deal with these impacts? And also to look at reducing carbon emissions. Who needs to reduce what and by how much? And this is where as individuals we can all play our part. So what does the Lord require of us? This is a question that's asked in the book of Micah. The answer is to act justly, to love mercy and to walk humbly with our God. If we are thinking about how we as Christians have a role to play in this crisis, there are a number of things we can pray about and we can do ourselves. We can examine our own heart to do with this. The first is the injustice of the situation. The nations that are causing the majority of the pollution, the climate change emissions, are not necessarily the nations that will suffer the most serious consequences. Those tend to be the more poorer nations in the global south, and they need our help. This is not justice. We need to help. God calls us to care for the world and to care for our vulnerable neighbours. And we need to show how we are doing this as Christians, either by our own actions or by helping those charities that work in these poorer communities. And we need to follow what the Bible tells us about caring for creation. All of this is tied together. If we care for our creation, for God's creation, we will be caring for the people who live in it. The picture on the slide here is of the Pacific island nation Tuvalu. This is the first nation that will disappear with rising sea levels, and it won't take much of a rise. Entire nation will be lost to the sea, displaced people, migration, and a need for a new home. Let's put this into our prayers. Let's pray for COP26 and the world leaders, that they will take this seriously. And let's pray for ourselves that we will find a way to help God's people and God's world. Amen.